Hello again, this is Bill Jones with recapturefederalism.com. Another mini documentary coming up today, and it's going to be, of course, from Freedom's Nest, the home of freedom. It's going to be a controversial subject, as they always are with me. I sometimes feel like I'm the only voice in America talking about communism and levying a war against the citizens. And of course, that's the subject today again. It's an ongoing series. If you've heard me before, that series title is American Communist Theocracy, the Great Tribulation, and Confidence Game. Today's title and subject is SCOTUS, and that, of course, is the abbreviation for the Supreme Court of the United States. SCOTUS, levying war and treason against the governments of we the people. I guess it doesn't get any more controversial than that. One of the three branches of the federal government. And we'll get into it very, very deep. Probably be a very long mini documentary. And we'll start off, of course, I do my administrative stuff, which is the oath I take and go into battle stations. We'll be back shortly. And the first thing we always do is take care of administrative business. Got to do the business first, and that's the oath. I, William R. Jones, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, so help me God. And as I always say, been keeping that oath since 1965, July 1965, when I joined the Navy. To see the world, and what did I see? The Atlantic, it was frantic. Well, yeah, the enemy then was communism, as it is now. And what I mean by communism is a generic term to me. Those adhering to the Communist Manifesto and the guidelines of the Communist Party in 1921. That's what I mean by communist. They're totalitarians, they're political party supremacy, despotic, the whole thing there. And it's a lot easier to just say commie or communist. And that's what I mean by that. And general quarters, all hands man your battle stations, up and forward to starboard, down and aft to port, set material condition zebra throughout the ship. This is not a drill. Communist insurrection. General quarters. Okay, and let's get right into this. Of course, what I have up here right now is a slide. Federalist Papers 51. The structure of government must furnish the proper checks and balances between the different departments. It was an editorial during the ratification process. There were 85 Federalist Papers. This is Federalist 51. They were printed in newspapers under the pseudonym Publicus. This particular one says it's Hamilton or Madison. I tend to think and go along with many of the people who say it probably is Madison. And it was published in the New York Packet, Friday, February 8th, 1788. This is, as I say, the ratification process. They were explaining the Constitution, what it was all about. As I say, 85. When I had went back to college, university, I was in my 40s. wasn't the brightest bulb in the box, you know. 20 years I was a sophomore, and I went back, and I had finished getting a associate degree at the community college in business, believe it or not, and then I went off to Governor State University. Had, of course, this interest in politics and communism and fighting communism since I was 15 years old. I'm 70 now. 55 years I've been looking into this. Well, anyway, I was in the public administration major, and I was a U.S. Constitution law class, and we, of course, talked about the Federalist Papers. And I'll never forget my college professor. There we were one evening in class. It was an evening class. And he starts talking about the Federalist Papers and says of Federalist 51, this to him was the most important of all the Federalist Papers. I've read this several times. I've read some of the other Federalist Papers. I have not read all of them. I get references and then go to some of them. And I will talk about another one in reference to Federalist 51, but it is a special one. It is, no doubtably, in my opinion also, and I concur with that professor, that this is the most important of the Federalist Papers. It's a checks and balances for our entire governmental system. That governmental system, and you'll see that later on in the last few words of this entire Federalist Papers, the federal system of America. And that's what this is. It is a definitive paper regarding our government. It shows the different departments, and when they mean the different areas of the government is what that meant. That's the terminology they were using back then. We probably wouldn't use that terminology today. But the different departments at the federal level, there were three. In the first part of this Federalist Papers 51, it relates to the three branches of the federal government. And then it relates to the states, and the people of the states. By the way, states do not have rights. Okay, you always hear that. States' rights, states' rights. No, the state is an inanimate object. The people have the rights, and I'll show you where that comes in as we go along. You have the states, the people of those states. They each have constitutions, and then they're under the umbrella of the Confederation. About the third paragraph down on this, and I'm going to read. I don't like to read that much, but then I find myself having to read a lot of this stuff because I source it. That's the trouble that Senator Joe McCarthy had in the 50s. He made, I think, two major mistakes. One, he didn't source his stuff. He just made claims about that and then didn't back it up with sources. So it left him open to heavy-duty criticism. And I have the feeling he felt he was going to be defended by somebody somewhere along the line, like the media, the press. Are you kidding me? Anyway, he didn't. He got no support from anybody. He was left, as they say, out to hang to dry there. Yeah, they left him hanging. About the third paragraph into the Federalist Papers 51, one of the famous quotes, I want to read it, a couple sentences. The interests of man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself? But the greatest of all reflections on human nature. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and the next place to oblige it to govern itself. And after 200 plus years, there's the problem that we face. They knew it back then. Madison, I believe Madison, knew it back then. They all knew it, all the founders. They were generally on the same wavelength. In some details they were not, of course. But they came up with the consensus, which was the Constitution. Enable the government to control the governed. They do a lot of controlling of the governed now, don't they? But no, they do not find the obligation to control itself. No, they have become the masters of the population control movement. The slaves, the communist slaves. Slaves of world communism. And we shall get into that. As you can see by this, we're in the 1788. Constitution been drawn up, looking for ratification. And there's people out pounding the drums. There's Federalist and there's Anti-Federalist. The argument going back and forth, the Federalist would win out in this debate, and the Constitution would be ratified. That does not diminish the Anti-Federalist positions. A lot of what they said and were fighting for turned out to end up true. For you see, you getting back to that obligation to control yourself, that's one of the concerns that they had, that people, because the system is only good as those that govern, and govern with integrity. And that's where we have a problem. There are checks and balances which are not being followed. Now, how do we get to 1788? Well, we have the Declaration of Independence in 1776, July 4th, or thereabouts. And right now, a little word from the Declaration of Independence. I've been over this, and I've gone through the entire Declaration of Independence, a previous presentation. I'm just going to make two statements or references to the Declaration of Independence right now. One is a famous quote, of course. All these grievances they had. And the quote is this: "In every stage of these oppressions we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be ruler of a free people." Very appropriate then and today, because we have a lot of people in power who are unfit to govern a free people. They act as tyrants, and worse than that, they are levying war and acting like treasonous. We shall get into that later. The last paragraph in the Declaration of Independence, I want to talk about, there's a reference in here. "Appealing as Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies solemnly publish and declare that these colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states." And of course those independent states are made up of good people. You know where that comes from? The first 5 verses of the Holy Bible. That is correct. and we shall get into that a little bit later. But we had a Declaration of Independence. Now, there was no federal constitution. There wouldn't be a federal constitution until 1788 when it's ratified. 1776 and 1788, about 12 years. What happened in those 12 years? Well, first of all, those 13 colonies, which became states because of the Declaration of Independence, had their own constitutions. Yeah, they did. They had their own constitutions. We didn't need a federal constitution because they each had their own. And interestingly enough, there's a little bit different. Some even had the Constitution before the Declaration of Independence, and some right after, and some a little bit later. They would gather together and come out with these constitutions. The first Constitution, the state of Pennsylvania, is from, of course, that was in the same town, in the same hall as where the Declaration of Independence was. Pennsylvania, the president of that Constitutional Convention was Benjamin Franklin. Old Ben Franklin, he was in charge of that convention. September 28, 1776, they come out with a Constitution. One of the most interesting sections of that, in the first whole bunch of sections there, I shouldn't say section. It's the first Bill of Rights. There's 16 of them. The Bill of Rights under the state constitution of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And one's most interesting thing, we wouldn't have the first 10 federal amendments and Bill of Rights until 1791. But they had Bill of Rights in those first constitutions, and some of them were specified, and some of the inherent rights were not specified. But 16 of these were specified under the Pennsylvania Constitution. Interestingly enough, number 3, to me, the most beautiful 23 words of any constitution, including the federal constitution, is in the Constitution, the first Constitution, state of Pennsylvania. Number 3, it reads, that the people of this state shall have the sole, exclusive, and inherent right of governing and regulating the internal police of the same. Maybe I ought to read that again and not goof it up. Number 3, inherent right. Quote, that the people of this state have the sole, exclusive, and inherent right of the governing and regulating the internal police of the same. Wow. You see, this is before the 10th Amendment. And all the power, it's the sole, exclusive, and inherent right of governing and regulating. There's not supposed to be any federal regulations. They, of course, in the Constitution, come up with restrictions on the federal government. There is a bond between the governing and the governed. And the governed give a very limited power to the federal government because it's all supposed to be sole, exclusive, and inherent governing the regulations of the people of the states. Not the states, the people of the states. Rights are human rights. They're not states' rights. They end up giving the federal government limited powers. And of course we know in 1791 when they passed the Bill of Rights, They come back and they say that about the people of the states. It goes back to the states, to the people. What isn't in the Constitution. And then we have court decisions and legislation later on where there's the usurpation of the basic human rights of Americans. But you should realize that happened later. But between 1776 and 1788, there was a form of government which was known as the Articles of Confederation. Articles of Confederation, and they're from March 1, 1781. It's about 5 years, 4.5, I suppose, 4.5 years after the Declaration of Independence, and it's 4.5 years roughly after the first Constitution in the state of Pennsylvania. Boy, they were running a loose ship there to start out with. And that's one of the reasons they ended up getting rid of the Articles of Confederation. They left themselves vulnerable to the foreign powers. But the Articles of Confederation, you ought to read it sometime. Article 1, the style of this confederacy shall be the United States of America. Now you notice I'm talking about confederacy, and we're going to talk about Federalist 51. There's a confederacy in there also, because we still are a confederation. Article 2, each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by this confederation expressly delegated to the United States, the Congress assembled. There they go. Again, they're giving up some rights, but they're retaining the majority of them, obviously. What isn't designated is still in the states, which retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power. You see, it's still back in the states. The limited federal government. Oh, but those political party supremacists, they can't have that now, can they? We'll get into that in just a bit. In Federalist 51, going back to that, there's a statement in here about Republican government, Republican principle, but Republican government. In Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. That's correct. Of the three branches of government, the legislative predominates. Not Barack Obama or FDR or Richard Nixon. No, it's supposed to be the representatives and the senators. That's who it's supposed to be. They're supposed to be running the show and setting everything up, and the executive branch only operates as an executive branch. They don't make the legislation. They don't make Obamacare, or as I call it, communist care. Then there's later on, they have another quote, and I'm going to talk to you about compound republics. We are not a single republic. We just don't have a federal constitution. We are a compound republic. We presently have 51 constitutions. We have one federal, and we've got the 50, we the people of the states, constitutions. Of course, we had an election down in Puerto Rico, and if they ever get their act together, they will become the 51st state. They, of course, have to come up with a constitution, and it has to be approved by the federal government, the legislative branch, by the way. I suppose Barack might want to just slap down the gavel. He's a judge and jury and executioner, so he can just come up and say it, I guess. He thinks he can do anything he wants. That's what we're talking about, isn't it? And the judges think they can do anything they want too. Judicial tyrants. But here we're going to talk about the single republic and the compound republic. This paragraph. There are moreover two considerations particularly applicable to the federal system of America, which place that the system in a very interesting point of view. First, in a single republic, all the power surrendered by the people is submitted to the administration of a single government, and the usurpations are guarded against by the division of the government into distinct and separate requirements. This is what, side note, this is just what they said. If we were a single republic, which we are not, we would have the federal government like we have it, and then you should not have any usurpations because you have three departments or three branches of government. Okay? But that's not where we are. Let's go back to the documentation. And here I am. In a compound republic of America, the power surrendered by the people is first divided between two distinct governments, and then the portion allotted each subdivided among distinct and separate departments. Hence, a double security arises to the rights of the people. Side note, you notice it's not the rights of the state, it's the rights of the people. Going back to the document, the different governments will control each other at the same time that each will be controlled by itself. Second, it is of great importance in a republic not only to guard against the society, against the oppression of its rulers, but to guard one part of society against the injustice of another, of the other part, Different interests necessarily exist in different classes of citizens. If a majority be united by a common interest, the rights of the minority will be insecure. Well, we'll get into that a lot later when you talk about the communist civil rights movement. They then go farther on in this Federalist 51, Madison does, and they talk about the Confederation. That's the states getting together. They're able to individually act. They're a backup to protect the people, the citizens, against the federal government. That's what the primary purpose. That's what they're saying here. Protecting against usurpations. And in the last sentence of 51, and happily for the Republican cause, and Republican cause is capitalized, comma, the practical sphere may be carried to the very great extent by judicious modification and mixture of the federal principle. So you have Republican cause, federal principle. They also talk about Republican principles. That's all that things right now that we don't have, because we have a corrupt individuals who have joined together, and we have political party supremacy. And I'm going to be getting into that next. We go forward after 1788, then we go to 1781, and we have the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, popularly known as the Bill of Rights. There were 12 which were considered, 10 passed, and that's known as the Bill of Rights. To me, the most important one of the whole bunch, because they have a controlling interest of all those, and they have a controlling interest of the entire system under Federalist 51s is the 10th Amendment. And of course, that was bastardized by the political party supremacist people. And we'll get into political parties. We do have the Republican principles in Federalist 10, which was also written by James Madison. And that's why I feel he is the one that wrote 51. Who talks about 9 and 10, which 9 was Alexander Hamilton, and 10 is Madison. You'll notice the wording in between in 10 and in 51 is the references are there. In Federalist 10, Madison talks about the United States is not a pure democracy. We hear people, especially the Democratic Party, and Hillary, for instance, talks about Harry Reid. I did a whole presentation about Harry Reid. He admits that he's a communist. He talks about democracy. And I will relate that later on. They talk about that in the Communist Confession of Faith about democracies. In 10, 9 and 10, they talk about insurrections. We end up having the first constitutional president. I talked about the Articles of Confederation. There was 10 presidents under the Articles of Confederation. 1-year terms. The first president of the United States under the Constitution is George Washington. Probably the only president who really didn't want to be president. But he was president. He was talked into it. They drafted him. And in 1796, he's on his way out of office, and he writes the George Washington farewell address. Recommended reading for everyone. I'm going to go over a couple of items that he talked about. He talked about many of them, including foreign influences and wars and revenue and things. But in the discussion that I'm having today, we're going to talk about two things. 1, political parties, and 2, religion and morality. Washington warns, and he does so in 6 paragraphs, about the dangers of party politics. He at one point says if the people want it, they need to have an amendment. Of course, we've never had an amendment, but he talks about the dangers of it. There's one paragraph he talks. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetuated the most horrid enormities, abnormalities, I should say, is itself a frightful despotism, but this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. He's talking about political parties. Boy, how that has come to pass. We've had political parties, and they've gotten to be more and more stronger. We've gone farther and farther away from Article 6 of the Constitution of the United States. And by the way, supreme law of the land, parties are not mentioned. Political parties are not mentioned anywhere in the Constitution because they're illegal. There's no legality, no legal basis, no authority for political parties to govern. Okay? That's very important to know, because what do we have right now? It's all we have is parties. We don't have any independent thinkers in the states or the federal government. There aren't any. You have to belong to a party to govern. And that's what's wrong with that picture. I had that quote in the next paragraph. Washington says, without looking forward to an extremity of this kind, which nevertheless ought not to be entirely out of sight, the common and continual mischiefs of the spirit of party are sufficient to make it the interest of duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain it. the following paragraph of that one, the next paragraph, he talks about parties and that they, quote, foments occasionally riots and insurrection, unquote. If you've heard me before, my last ones, and I'll even talk about this one, in effect, the Supreme Court justices and the political party supremacy, and the Supreme Court is a product of the two-party system and the two-party system supremacy. The parties themselves, the individual members of those parties, the three branches of government, including the Supreme Court, they are in effect insurgents, treasonous, and terrorist, communist. And I will get into that later as I go into the communist side of this whole equation. The next area he talks about, as I said, religion and morality. I'm just going to read one paragraph, and it's somewhat of a lengthy one, but I'm going to read it. There are about 6 paragraphs where he discusses and relates to religion and morality. This is very, very important. And I'm going to read just this one paragraph regarding this. There are others. I suggest people read the entirety of the Washington farewell address. But quoting, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would be that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. The mere politician, equally with the pious man, ought to respect and cherish them. A volume could not trace all their connections with private and public felicity. Let it simply be asked, where is the security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation deserts the oaths which are the instruments of investigation in the courts of justice? Let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on the minds of peculiar structure, reason, and experience, both forbid us to expect that the national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. Wow. Wow. And where are we at today? Where are we at today? I'm going to get into that, because now I'm going to make it into a personal thing. There has been religious persecution of me personally, and of course of millions of other people too. But I'm going to bring this down to a personal level, because if you have religious persecution from the government against one individual, that's religious persecution against every individual. And when you have religious persecution, and when you do that by putting, quote, protected groups, unquote, against individuals and their religious beliefs, you have religious persecution. And if you have, again, religious persecution against one individual, you have it against all of the citizens. I mentioned Senator Joe McCarthy earlier in his character assassination. I think maybe the only other person in the last, I suppose, 60 years or 70 years who has been more maligned and a greater personal assassination is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I have in the past, talk about the greatest document written in the 20th century, I believe, was by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King in 1963, letter from a Birmingham jail. He would later be subverted by the communists. And we get into that right now. But he wrote that. It's 48 paragraphs. Another one. And you want to get the original because people have doctored it up. And a part of that character assassination of Reverend King is that they have doctored some of the original. You want the original? It's 48 paragraphs, pretty long, but it's worth the read. I think it's the best document, like I say, written in the 20th century. I'm just going to go over a couple of paragraphs. I've gone over some of this other stuff in the letter from the Birmingham jail in the past. But he talks, and it gets involved in religion and morality. He goes all through that. And laws, and the relations of morality and laws and biblical things. And there's one he talks about. Of course, there is nothing about this kind of civil disobedience. It was evident sublimely in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar, on the ground that a higher moral law was at stake. It was practiced superbly by the early Christians who were willing to face hungry lions and excruciating pain of chopping blocks rather than submit to certain unjust laws of the Roman Empire. To a degree, academic freedom is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience. In our own nation, the Boston Tea Party represented a massive act of civil disobedience. Reverend King mentioned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's Daniel 3, if you want to look at it, the Bible. King Nebuchadnezzar wanted the peeps to worship a golden idol. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego says, won't do that. That violates the first commandment. That's putting a god in place, a god small g, in place of the god, the big G, the capital G. It violates the first commandment. That's what we have today going on, by the way, the Supreme Court, and I'll get into that in a little bit. The following paragraph, King relates this. We should never forget that anything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal, and everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany, even though I am sure that had I lived in Germany at the time, I would have aided and comforted my Jewish brothers. If today I lived in a communist country where certain principles dear to the Christian faith are suppressed, I would openly advocate disobeying the country's anti-religious laws. Anti-religious laws. And I'm sure if the Reverend King were alive today, he would be opposed to several of these laws and decisions made by the Supreme Court. And I think he would agree with me that they were levying war against the citizens of the United States. Later on, he talks about Elijah Muhammad's Muslim movement. And then in the paragraph, and at the end of that paragraph, Nourished by Negroes' frustration over the continuing existence of racial discrimination, this movement is made up of people who have lost faith in America and who have absolutely repudiated Christianity and who have concluded that the white man is an incorrigible, quote, devil, unquote. Understand, this is Reverend King writing this. Fourth generation preacher man, traditional Christian preacher. He's writing that about the Muslims. You notice they're not called black Muslims yet. And I'll relate to that in the next paragraph after what I just read. I have tried to stand between those two forces, saying that we need to emulate neither the good do-nothingism, of the complacent nor the hatred and despair of the black nationalist. For there is more excellent way of love in nonviolent protest. I am grateful to God that through the influence of the Negro Church, the way of nonviolence became an integral part of our struggle. Black nationalist. Hatred. Black nationalist, by the way. The Black Panthers, black nationalist. Went by several different names. Also, there were white groups too. And later on in the 60s, after 1963. In 1965, if you just heard, Reverend King is going to try and mediate and get between this hate group and then the do-nothingism of others. That will be, in my opinion, a mistake. In my opinion, it will cause his assassination later on when they were done subverting him and using him to get rid of him. I have the feeling that he was going to break away again and be more independent, because I'm sure he saw the true colors of those communists. And I've said before, and I'll say it again, and I will continue to say it. God created Homo sapiens. The communists created blacks, gays, and the communist civil rights movement in 1965. And that's where this has come from. That's the basis that I talk about. And now I'm going to talk about something very personal. I am a Christian. I am a Lutheran Christian. I became a confirmed member of the Lutheran Church. 1959, I was 14 years old. And I'm going to talk about something very personal now. About my religion, my religious beliefs. I demand religious freedom. The government of the United States, including the Supreme Court of the United States, is committing, personally against me, religious persecution. Obviously, it's against other millions of people too. But I'm going to do this about me personally. I have a personal covenant with God. That's my religious belief. And it goes on from there. The slide you presently see is from Article 16 of the Augsburg Confession from 1530. It was written and edited by several people. One of the primary authors was Martin Luther. Dr. Martin Luther had a doctorate in Bible. He was excommunicated from the Roman Catholic Church for his principles and his refusal to recant those principles. I read a piece out of the letter from the Birmingham jail. There's another section in there where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. talks about Martin Luther and his courage, standing up for his principles and civil disobedience. And part of what you see is that the Augsburg Confession, which is a rather long document, was a clarification of Protestantism in the Roman Catholic, the Holy Roman Empire. I'll get it right yet. The Holy Roman Empire. Their Diet of Augsburg, before Charles V, they clarified the position of Protestantism and Lutheranism. The Augsburg Confession is the Book of Concord, is also known as the Lutheran Confession of Faith. As I say, I am a Lutheran Catholic. It relates in Article 16, as you see, about civil affairs. Yeah, there's no separation of church and state. People who belong to churches, they're part of the citizens, and they have citizens' rights. And that's what this is about. And right at the end, you see what's highlighted. That's religious persecution. I'm going to get into it. And this is what the Supreme Court of the United States has done and probably will continue to do. But let's read this. Of civil affairs, they teach that lawful civil or ordinances are good works of God, and that it is the right for Christians to bear civil office, to sit as judges, to judge matters by imperial and other existing laws, to award just punishments, to engage in just wars, to serve as soldiers, to make legal contracts, to hold property, to make oath when required by magistrates, to marry a wife, to be given in marriage. Wow. You have a religious right and obligation to participate in governmental affairs, civil affairs. I don't know if I'd use the word condemn, but they did back then. They found it reprehensible. There was certain actions by other people, and they wanted clarification for that. There was a religious conflict at that time between the Roman Catholics, the Lutheran Catholics, Anabaptist, and others, including Jews. They condemn the Anabaptists who forbid these civil offices to Christians. The Anabaptists, and even today, there's some evangelical Christians who don't even believe you shouldn't vote. Not that you don't have a right to vote, but you shouldn't vote. You shouldn't be part of governmental affairs. And Luther and the other Protestant leadership said, no, you ought to be partaking in the government. Then you get into section 4 here, through, I guess it's 7. They condemn also those who do not place evangelical perfection in the fear of God and in faith, but in forsaking civil offices, for the gospel teaches an eternal righteousness of the heart. Meanwhile, it does not destroy the state or the family, but very much requires that they be preserved as ordinances of God, and that charity be practiced in such ordinances. Therefore, Christians are necessarily bound to obey their own magistrates and laws, save only when commanded to sin, for then they ought to obey God rather than men. Acts 5:29. And what does Acts 5:29 say? Well, it says, if you got the laws of God and the laws of man, the laws of God are supreme over the laws of man. And what do we have going on today? And here comes the religious persecution. We have commands through decisions and laws of man over God. You have people in the government, political parties, political party supremacy, which is adhering to the Communist Manifesto and guidelines of the Communist Party, 1921. That's treason, by the way. Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution of the United States, treason. Levying war, adhering to other things, other types of governments and what have you. And I'm going to read that specifically in the next slide, or in the next segment. But here you have, when you have same-sex marriage, that is a command to sin. If you put man's laws ahead of God, that violates the first commandment. That's what Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was talking about. And that's what you have now. Obamacare violates the 10th commandment. It's covetousness. Thou shalt not covet anything of thy neighbors. And we have redistribution of wealth. Communism. That is commanding to sin. That's right. Religious persecution against me personally. That's why I'm yelling up, standing up against me personally. Obviously, it's against a lot of other individuals also. But persecution, religious persecution against one is against all. Article 3 is about judicial powers of the United States. The Supreme Court and all the lower courts. Of course, then you have the state courts, which represent the peoples of those individual states. But you have Article 3, and it explains all about the judicial system. One of the shortest sections of the Constitution in relationship, let's say, to the other two branches of government. But we have, I said I'd read this, and I'm gonna, because Section 3, Article 3, Section 3, treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them or in adhering to the enemies, giving them aid and comfort. No person shall be convicted of treason unless the testimony of two witnesses to the same overt act or the confession in open court. Two witnesses. I mean, you got millions of witnesses. If somebody makes a decision which is adhering to the enemies and giving them aid and comfort, such as world communism, and they are levying war. Every decision that they make, whether it's religious persecution or some other crime against the people, and that's exactly what it is. It's the crime of treason. It's also terrorism, and I'll get into that. You notice in this civil affairs paragraph that I have read, you'll see the word bound, necessarily bound. That term bound, it's used twice in Article 6 of the Constitution of the United States. There's two paragraphs, there's really three. The first one relates back to the Articles of Confederation. They accept all the debts from the Articles of Confederation. Of course, that was satisfied, so it's really now not applicable at the present time any longer. But then the other two paragraphs, one is the Supremacy Clause, and the other is a religion clause. Yeah, there's a religion clause in the Constitution of the United States. But that term bound is in there. The religion clause, they also talk about oath. By the way, oaths, and you'll see there's a couple of different oaths they use for the courts. I read my oath there, so help me God. By the way, the judicial oaths all say that too. A lot of the other federal oaths also use, so help me God. Bound, that's a legal term. It means an obligation, a legal and or moral obligation. Legal and moral obligation. It's used twice in Article 6. And they talk about oaths. So if you have somebody who's adhering to the enemy and levying war, they've committed perjury, haven't they? Because they swear an oath to defend and protect the Constitution of the United States. And that's what you have with a whole bunch of people in the government of the United States, federal and state levels. Communist. Now I'm going to go into communism. I'm going to show you where they're terrorists. Around 1500, which is roughly the same time as Martin Luther and the Protestant movement, Protestantism in Europe. I probably shouldn't use the term movement. I've said this in the past. Movement nowadays reflects a lot having to do with the communist. They all have all sorts of movements. Biggest one, which is the human population control movement. But I have a picture here of a book. That's a book I have. It is called Machiavelli the Prince. Oh, I see probably some eyes rolling back here. Oh, I'm going back to high school or college. Machiavellian the Prince. This particular book I still have it. This one has a copyright of 1952. I laugh about that every time because it's 1 year older than the foundation and creation of the Communist Department of Education in 1953. Machiavellian, the Prince. The students of this are many. Stalin and Hitler were, as says in this book in the foreword, were students of Machiavelli. I go one step further. Machiavelli, the Prince, Communist Manifesto, and the teachings of Engels and Marx are Machiavellian on steroids. It's the perfection of what Machiavelli wrote about. They have Engels and Marx did a wonderful, great job, very successful in perfecting evil. Evil, that's correct. Machiavellian on steroids, that's the Communist Manifesto. If you've ever heard of my other presentations, I always quote page 26 of the Communist Manifesto and page 34 of the Communist Manifesto. There's two core quotes from those areas that sums up the Communist Manifesto pretty much, which is the Manifesto of the Communist Party, Karl Marx, Frederick Engels, February 1848. There's been some editing of it. And the quote, "There are besides eternal truths such as freedom, justice, etc., that are common to all states of society, but communism abolishes eternal truth and abolishes all religion and all morality. Instead of constituting them on a new basis, it therefore acts in contradiction to all past historical experiences." And the historical, and that's page 26, Communist Manifesto. Historical experience of communism is slavery, murder, death, destruction. I mean, they say so. They abolish all eternal truths, abolishes all religion and all morality. What do we say from Washington? Religion and morality are necessary for a free government. Of course, Communist Manifesto, that's not free government. That's bad government. Communism is a religion, by the way. In 1847, Engels wrote the Communist Confession of Faith. Communism is a religion, a religious supremacist organization, world communism. They abolish all religion. They are supreme. Page 34, Communist Manifesto. Finally, they labor everywhere for the union and agreement of democratic parties of all countries. The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of existing conditions, that the ruling classes tremble at the communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of the world, of all countries, unite. Almost said of all of the world, but that's another area where they talk about. Page 34 of the Communist Manifesto. Let the ruling classes tremble. That's terrorism. That's correct. And when we talk about insurrection, and I talk about it all the time, and I'll bring up my graphic. I've had this a few years. The silent secret American insurrection and revolutionary movement. That's the communist movement in America, insurrection. By the way, it's been going on. The first case of it, the violence, resulted in the death of police officers in Chicago in 1886. Yeah, that's right. Insurrection, 1886. Anarchy, they call it anarchy, it's really insurrection by the communists. That's correct. Then you have the progressivism and progressives. By the way, progressives are communists. I can show you and prove that also. But you'll notice in my chart, now I make 3 points, that's why it's a triangle. The Holy Bible of Good Government, it's Romans chapter 13. We're going to get into that in a second. Federal System of America, that's Federalist 51. We have a free citizen class, so those are the good people. Romans chapter 13. You'll notice on the right-hand side, I've got the opposite of that. Federal System of America, then you have communism. You have a free citizen class, you have the communist criminal class. We'll get into that. Romans 13, chapter 13. And get into that in a second. And then you have the Communist Confession of Faith. So you have a conflict between two religions. One seeks the supremacy of the world. The other, as you see on the bottom, is individuality. And you have class warfare. I talked about it being personal. I'm a Christian, so I'm going to talk in a Christian perspective. If you're a Jew and you practice Judaism, you can do some of the same stuff out of the Old Testament. Love of God. And I talk about that, and there's a relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament. John 15, 1 through 17 talks about love. And John 15, 18 through 27 talks about hate. We're going to get into that in a second. Now we're talking about good and bad government. You know, it all comes down to the basics of good and evil. And we got that. Where do we get that from? We get that in the first 5 verses of the Bible. It's Judaism. It's creation. That is correct. We get good and evil, good and wickedness. It's all there in the first 5 verses. And what does it say? I use the Lampsis Bible, by the way, Aramaic to English. Chapter 1 of Genesis. God created the heavens and the earth in the very beginning, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the water. Verse 3, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. Verse 4, and God saw that the light was good, and that God separated the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. The evening and the morning, we go back and forth between good and evil, don't we, as individuals? We sin at times. We're good at other times. Hopefully we're more good than we are bad. And we do a greater good than a greater bad. How does this relate to communism? Engels and Marx were atheists. They were atheists. They don't believe in creation. They did not believe in creation. They, by the way, both came from religious families. And they broke away. And they denied the Lord God. That is correct. And in this first 5 chapters, light is good. Darkness is evil. How do we know? Well, darkness, one of the definitions is evil and wickedness. So you have evil and good. We all make a choice. We all make a choice to be good or to be evil. And when we're evil for Christians, we believe you should repent, recognize your errors of your ways, and confess those errors, and repent. Of course, if you don't believe in good and evil, you don't believe in God, then I guess there is no light. Perpetual darkness. There's other places in the Bible talks about that too, in the New Testament. But I don't think I'll get to that today. Some other time. But why don't we talk about good government? I'm going to go to Romans chapter 13. Of course, any of you Jewish brothers and sisters out there may be listening. Hang in there with me, please. Don't go running away. I am not out to convert anyone to Christianity. I am just stating what I witness and what I see and what I believe personally. My personal covenant with God. My relationship with God. I'm going to go to Romans 13. And as I said, if you're Jewish, hang in there. Romans 13, written by Paul, the Apostle Paul, is 14 verses. There is only one verse that mentions Jesus Christ, and that is number 14, and I won't read that one. If you're Christian, I would suggest you read it sometime. But the first 13 verses do not mention Jesus. In fact, it's not really, well, it is Christianity, but it's adopted from Judaism, because the first 13 verses is pure Judaism. Okay? And I'm going to go through it. Let every soul be subject to the sovereign authorities, for there is no power which is not from God, and those who are in authority are ordained by God. Whoever therefore resists the civil authority resists the command of God, and they who resist shall receive judgment to themselves. For the judges are not a menace to good works, but to evil. Now if you wish not to be afraid of authority, then do good, and you will be praised for it. For the ruler is the minister of God to you for good. But if you do that which is wrong, be afraid, for he is not girded with the sword in vain, for he is a minister of God, and an avenger of wrath upon those who commit crime. Therefore we must be obedient, not only in fear of wrath, but also for our conscience sake. For this reason you pay head tax also, for they are ministers of God who are in charge of these things. Render therefore to every one as is due to him, head tax to him who is in charge of head tax, duty to him who is in charge of taxes, reverence to whom reverence is due, and honor to whom honor is due. Owe no man anything, but love one another, for he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law, which says, Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet. And if there is any other commandment, it is fulfilled in this saying, namely, Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Love does not work evil to his neighbor, because love is the fulfillment of the law. Know this also, that now is the time and the hour that we should awake from our sleep, for now and our salvation is nearer than when we believed. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Let us therefore cast off the works of darkness, let us put upon the armor of light. Let us walk decently as in the daylight, not in clamor and drunkenness, not in the practice of immorality, not in envy and strife. Those are the 13 verses. Good and evil, making a choice. And that's what good government is. It's a choice for good. It's a choice to follow the basis of our legal system, which is the 10 Commandments. Yes, owe no man anything. Reverence do reverence, honor do honor. For judges are not a menace to good works, but to evil. And what if you reverse that? What do you have? That's where we are today in the United States. People have made a choice to go onto the dark side, to be on the dark side, to be on the side of evil. We have people in power, they have made that decision, adhering to the darkness of Engels and Marx. Now I'm going to go to John chapter 15, and I'm not going to read the whole thing. But again, the part where it's about hate, I'm going to get into part of that, because it relates to communism. It relates to bad government. It relates to decisions that have been part of the 3 branches of the federal government and in the states also, and specifically decisions by the Supreme Court. And let me see here. Verse 21, we'll start there. But they will do all these things to you for the sake of my name, because they do not know him who sent me. If I had not come and spoken to them, they would be without sin, but now they have no excuse for their sins. He who hates me hates my Father also. If I had not done works before their eyes, such as no other man has ever done, they would be without sin. But now they have seen and hated me, and also my Father. Next is verse 25. Listen to this closely. So that the word which is written in their law may be fulfilled, and they hated me for no reason. That's crucial. So that the word which is written in their law, and that's the law of darkness, the law of evil, the law of the devil and Satan. That is their law, the law of bad government and evil. As you see, on the one side you have the goodness, the Judeo-Christian moral code, morality, religion that Washington talked about. And the other side, what do you have? You have violence, combat, illegality, class warfare, chaos. The preambles of the Constitution, both state and federal, talks about ensuring domestic tranquility. You cannot have domestic tranquility if that's all you have is communist chaos and violence and illegality. Let's further look at communism. As I said, Communist Confession of Faith, communism is a religion. In 1847, Engel wrote that. It was a catechism type document. Had 22 questions and answers. For instance, the first one, are you a communist? The answer, of course, is yes, if you're a communist. Second was, what's the aim of the communist? And they go through that. The question 3 is, how do you wish to achieve this aim? And the answer, you're going to love this. We talked earlier about property rights in that civil affairs statement from Augsburg Confession. How do you wish to achieve this aim of communism? Answer, by the elimination of private property and its replacement by the community of property. Redistribution of wealth, a violation of the 10th commandment of God. They further go through these questions. I recommend you get it. You get it at several different places. One is Marxist.org is where I get my stuff. They love to talk about their stuff here. They love to talk about their stuff. And in 1848, they took the Communist Confession of Faith, and they put it into as part of the principles of communism under the Communist Manifesto. It's noting that question 17, they talk about democracy. They talk about democratic constitutions. It's how you use and work with democracies. Of course, as I discussed earlier, we don't have a democratic constitution. We're a republic, a compound republic. They talk about democracy in the Confessions of Faith. And the answer is, let me go through the question. What would be your first measures once you have established democracy? So they're establishing democracy in, place of our republic. They've been doing that for 100 years. And the answer is guaranteeing the subsistence of the proletariat. Well, you wonder where minimum wage comes from, and that's where it comes from. That's where it comes from. And we'll now go into a discussion regarding the principles of communism, where they elaborate off the confession of faith of communism. And we'll do that here next. I'm going to get into just lightly in relationship to the overall situation, the revolutionary movement and insurrection, lightly now into what the courts have been doing recently. I will be doing a very extensive one, mini documentary concerning the in-depth the principles of communism. As I said, the insurrection in America started violently in 1886 in different levels of violence, nonviolence, political action, political supremacy, many of it disguised as progressivism and things, and social democrats and things of that sort. Communists lie a lot, and there's a lot of communists around. And we'll get into that deeply some other time, the depth of it. But just to tell you, just to mention it without going into any detail at all, some treasonable acts that have occurred and which are part of the insurrection and revolutionary movement going back 100 years. The 16th Amendment, Federal Reserve System, that's all communism. The tampering of the court in the 30s by a communist president, FDR. Yeah, that's what I said, communist president. We show all those things too. The National Relief Act, that was communism. The tampering of the court, that was communism. Is communism now. We're still suffering from that. The Interstate Commerce Clause, communism. Social Security, communism. 1949 Federal Housing Act, FHA, communism. The IRS is a communist agency. As I mentioned earlier, 1965, the Communist Civil Rights Movement, that in the Civil Rights Division of the DOJ, communism. All these departments, the federal departments, they all belong in the states. These things were restricted from the federal government. So you have all these things, and I'm not going to get into individual ones. I'm just going to get into the ones here recently. Redistribution of wealth with Obamacare. We go back to Nixon. Nixon had several of them too. He signed into law, him collaborating with the Democratic Party. He was a communist president also. Obama, I did a mini documentary on him, Communist Obama, like father, like son, and got into that somewhat as deep as I could. But what has happened now with the courts? And that's who I'm talking about. They're collaborating with the, they're not a checks and balance. No, they're a collaboration. They're not supposed to be a collaboration. They're violating the Constitution. They're aiding and abetting the world communism. As I mentioned, the Confession of Faith was a catechismal type document, and they switched to the principles of communism, and that is, I believe there's 23 questions instead of 20. No, there's more than that. There's 25 questions instead of the 22, and there are some of the questions are the same and some are different. They ask them different. Question 14, what is the new social order? What will this new social order have to be like? Well, it turns out it's like communism. That's what the new social world is. So you have these people talking about 1,000 rays of light, whatever Bush talked about, senior. It's all part of that stuff. They've all been involved around it. One of the big questions is number 18, what will the course of this revolution? I'm not going to get into it too deeply, but they have 13 line items there. The first one is limitation of private property through progressive taxation, heavy inheritance taxes, abolition of inheritance through collateral lines, brothers, nephews, etc., forced loans. So you have the national debt, that's a forced loan. That's slavery, by the way, and violation of the 13th Amendment. But who's telling you that? Is anybody telling you that? Anybody in the press telling you that? Forced loan, the national debt, that's a debt on every citizen in the United States, forced loan. Your grandchildren, your children, they are slaves, indentured servants, violation of the 13th Amendment. But the courts let that go through. They backed that up. They stood behind all these communist movement items, and they keep expanding it. Then they go over just another one. What will the influence of a communist society on the family? And this is where same-sex marriage and the destruction, it specifically mentions the destruction of traditional marriage. What would the attitude of communism to existing nationalities? That they under page 25 of the Communist Manifesto, they talk about they don't recognize countries or nationalities. That's where your open border comes in. They're dealing with a corrupt Mexico. Okay? They won't admit to that. They won't talk to that. NBC, for instance. Univision, which is out of Mexico. They work hand in hand with a corrupt government in Mexico down there. We have all these people coming in. If I was a free citizen in Mexico, I'd be coming to the United States too. It's so corrupt with drug cartels and murder down there. It's a form of communism too. What will be the attitude of communism to existing nationalities? It eliminates them. It abolishes them. What will the attitude to existing religion? Talk about religious persecution. I already read it to you. Abolish all religions. They get into a little deeper. What will be the attitude to existing religions? This is personally to me. They're abolishing and making my religion disappear. My religious beliefs. That's where our freedom is gone. It's going to be run by communists. It is now. It's going to get worse. As bleak as all this is, there are ways out of this. God and the laws are on our side. What will be the attitude to existing religions? It says, one paragraph, all religions so far have been expressions of historic stages of development of individual peoples or groups of peoples, but communism is a stage of historical development which makes all existing religions superfluous and brings about their disappearance. Anti-Semitic, anti-Christian. Goodbye God, goodbye Christ, goodbye Holy Spirit, goodbye Judaism, goodbye Christianity. They talk about the past as the development of individual peoples or groups of people. Individuals, and that's what I talk about. Individuality. That's where religious freedom comes from, individual religious beliefs. And that's where the attack comes on. Go back to that forced loans. 1978 case, Marquette National Bank of Minneapolis versus First Credit Service of Omaha, I believe it was. The Supreme Court of the United States nullified usury laws. By the way, laws based on the theological studies of St. Thomas Aquinas. Juice loans, you know. There are limitations to the type of interest charges you have. We had 18 states. The rates, limits, caps, 9 to 12% variable. And the states that had usury laws. That was nullified. We now have some rates all the way up to 30%. That's just like Vito and his mob juice loans. That's communism. I can show you where that is too, where all that stuff is. I'm going to get into that deeper another time, another mini documentary. Get into this stuff really, really deep. It's all in relation. And what are they doing? How are they doing it? Guidelines of the Communist Party, 1921. There's 8 sections. That 8th section mentions combat, violence. That's what your courts are involved in. They're on the side of that. You have all these street gangs. They're not doing away with them in decades now. They're terrorists. They're considered terrorists. In my home state of Illinois, 2012, they declared that legislative finding street gangs is terrorism, domestic terrorism. Part of the guidelines of the Communist Party. Prison reform. What do you see the president going? He's doing it right coming up on the end of his stuff. Will you watch? He's going to be letting people out left and right and left and right. And that's all communism. Because he's a communist. So are the political parties. I've done many documentaries on this before. They're members of International Democratic Party of the United States. Is a member of the Progressive International. But you don't hear that, do you, from the media? From anybody. You don't even hear that stuff from the conservative talking heads. And with this, I think I'm going to stop right about now. We're at about an hour and a half. If you hear me anywhere that's not on my site, go to my site, please, and subscribe. We're going to be doing more. We're going to continue to do more. All the way. All the way. We got to go it all the way. And as I said earlier, there are ways to combat the communist. And I'm going to start getting into some more of that, into that deeper. There's ways of doing that. That's the other side. That's the good government side. Non-violently, you can combat against the combat troops of the communist. You can do it with counter-communist psychops working against the communist psychops. There's what's known as lawfare. You can take legal action against the Democratic Party and the Republican Party if you want. Primarily the Democratic Party. You can do that. I'll get into that deeper, how you can do that. Treason. They should be arresting people, these politicians. They're violating the law. Official misconduct. Treason. Subversion. Sedition. We as citizens, as free citizens, we need to work that way. But if you're not at my site, please go to my site, recapturefederalism.com, recapturefederalism.com. Go in there, subscribe. We're going to be expanding. We're going to have courses, things of that in the future. We're working on that, setting that up. Until next time, good day.